All right, so our presenter, I'm going to give you a food analogy. I did not eat lunch, so I'm hungry. So I want you to think of just a magnificent cheeseburger and think of all the layers, that make it that magnificent cheeseburger. So we're going to think about the lettuce, green. This is a Colorado guy who's coming to join us. Let's think of a juicy tomato, which could represent his twin sister and family that are close in Coloradans. Let's think of some onion to represent the former work you did as an attorney. Let's think of some mayonnaise as time he spent at the White House in quite a significant role. The cheese, for sure, makes the cheeseburger. So I'm thinking about cheese, begins with C, so I'm thinking of Colorado Public Radio, and he serves and has served, American cheese, and he has served on their board. I'm going to also think of maybe some spicy mayo or something we would add to that, which would be the Colorado Council of Churches that he also serves as a leader for. When I think about the meat of him, I'm super excited to share his brilliance as an author. It's not very often that you become an author and write 3 books, and how about 2 of them becoming James Beard award-winning books? So that's pretty significant and pretty meaty. And then I'm gonna also think about the paper that wraps up this cheeseburger, to kind of hold it all together and tie that to us as community members, and tie it as well to my work, which is at the Museum of Boulder, where Adrian happens to be serving in the capacity as co-project director of Proclaiming Colorado's Black History. So it's a 3-year project that's going to culminate into an exhibit, but yet not a culmination. It's going to continue, and it's going to be all about deepening curriculum with regard to the history of Black Coloradans. And Adrian is already working very closely with student researchers and someone who is a writer himself. You can imagine where that's going. I want to point out that there are some cards that represent some of his books at your table, and also some recipes. So be sure to look at those. And then the bookmark for you as well that gives you kind of an overview of who all is a part of this Proclaiming Colorado's Black History. So it is my honor to present to you this incredible cheeseburger. Adrian Miller.
Well, thank you, Lori. That's one of the most interesting introductions I've ever had. And as you went through it, I got nervous. I'm so relieved you didn't say anything about my buns. I know. So, good afternoon, Boulder Rotary. It's so good to be in front of you again. I have to ask 2 questions. How many of you have heard me speak before? Okay, good. And how many of you are from the South or have connections with the South? Okay, for all you people from the South, this whole presentation is going to be a duh moment. But I still have to go through it. And then I was thinking about what you said, Carl. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be silent and just show you pictures of barbecue. Then I'll take your questions. No, just kidding. All right. So this is me in one of my favorite barbecue joints in Colorado, Boney's Smokehouse. Unfortunately, Boney's closed in 2020 because of the pandemic. And this is really an allegory for African-American barbecues in urban areas in our country. They're disappearing, the brick and mortar locations. And so I was really sad to see, but you can see I was very impressed with the barbecue. I am the soul food scholar who's dropping knowledge like hot biscuits, and that's what I'm gonna do for the next 20 minutes or so. You are highly encouraged to do social media. I am soul food scholar on most platforms, so please show a brother some love there. Unless you're a hater, then don't, and you wanna put out something negative, then just hold on to that. There's really no reason to post. All right, so just quickly, my writing journey. I was born in Denver, which immediately loses me all street cred on the subject of barbecue. My sister back here is nodding her head. So let me win you back. try to. My parents are from the South. My mom's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad's from Helena, Arkansas. Great migration story. They independently came to Denver, met in the 60s, and then we lived in Denver and then moved out to the suburbs. So I went to Smoky Hill High School, if any of you know where that is. So even in an unlikely place like Denver, I was steeped in black food traditions. And I'm very grateful that my parents did that, because it would have been very easy for them to be in the white suburbs of Denver and put all of that aside, but they kept me connected to black culture. I'm very grateful for that. So practiced law for 4 years. This is not to disparage any attorneys in the audience, but I hated it. Got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. And you know it was bad because white people were joining in. Be at the copy machine, talk to a colleague named Becky. Hey, Becky, how's it going? She would just look at me and sing, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. It's like, dang. So I was going to open up a soul food restaurant. I had a chef, was raising money, and then I got a chance to work in the Clinton White House on something called the President's Initiative for One America. And in that initiative, here's the wild and crazy idea. If we just talked to one another and listened, we might realize we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us. Crazy, right? I know, right? Loved my time in the White House. I was there at the very end of Clinton's second term. Has anybody here ever met President Clinton? Okay, sir, in the back. Can you tell us about that experience? Yeah.
We met in the backyard of the two governors in Texas and he came down the road and after making hello. Can you hear me a little better now?
Yeah.
And he came down the rope and I put out my hand and I shook his hand, but I didn't let go. I said, I've got something I need to share with you. And I had the full Clinton treatment. I was the only person in his universe for the next few moments. And then I said to him, you're going to be the first Democrat I've ever voted for president. Don't let me down. And he looked me right in the eye and said, well, I won't.
That's great. That is perfect. Thank you. So like most people say, he locks you in, he makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. I worked for him for 1.5 years and I never got that. Every time I talked to him, it was a blank look. I'd say, Mr. President, get a blank look, like the one you're giving me right now. I'm Adrian Miller, blank look. And then I'd say, I work on your One America initiative. And he'd say something like, well, that's great. And then we would talk about whatever. So I wanted to be your senator at that time. So I was trying to get back to Colorado, start my political career. Job market was really slow. And so I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not going to tell you what shows. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, you know what? I should read something. Went to a bookstore, found a book on the history of Southern food, and that author wrote that the tribute to black achievement in American cooking has yet to be written. That's what started the journey. So soul food is a celebration of soul food. The way I organized that book is I created a representative soul food meal. I write a chapter about every part of the meal and explain what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, what it means for the culture, and there are recipes in that book. The second book, President's Kitchen Cabinet, was a collective biography of African-American presidential cooks, because while I was researching the soul food book, I came across the story of a few African-Americans who have cooked for our presidents. Every president, George Washington to Joe Biden, has had an African-American cooking for them in some capacity. So that was a collective biography, nominated for several awards, including the NAACP Image Award. I did not win, but I got closer to a lifelong goal. I always wanted to meet the actress Halle Berry. She was one of the presenters that year. So here's the progress I made, y'all. We were in the same room at the same time. If you go back and look at a recording of the ceremony, there's a moment where she stumbles over her words as she's presenting that captured the exact time when our eyes met, even though I was way up in the balcony. And then Black Smoke, United States of Barbecue, is I wrote this book because I was tired of white dudes getting all the credit when it comes to barbecue. If you watch TV shows, magazine articles, news, it's all about white dudes. You wouldn't even know that black people barbecue. So I felt like I needed to write this book. All right, so how did that get started? I'm working on my soul food book. I was thinking I'm going to include a chapter about barbecue, but I found so much stuff on barbecue. I said, no, it needs its own treatment. But then I'm watching the Food Network, and I see a commercial for Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I thought, let me just watch to see what the current trends are and who she celebrates. Credits roll 60 minutes later, and there's not one black person featured on that show. On barbecue in the South. So I thought, well, how does this happen? Doesn't square with my experience. And then the second thing is I thought, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was a commercial for Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue, sponsored by Alabama White Sauce. So thank you for laughing at these jokes. I work on these. So started looking around, and it was the same. Television, it was the same problem. Either black people were pushed to the margins of barbecue storytelling or left out entirely. So let's go to this. This is an illustration from a magazine in November 1895. There was something called the Atlanta Exposition, and they had a Georgia barbecue stand. So they had a live cooking demonstration of barbecue. And if we can zoom in on this one. So this is what barbecue was for several centuries. Whoops, wasn't supposed to do that. It was digging a trench. Yeah, if we'll zoom in again. Yeah, thank you. Digging a trench, a couple feet deep, a few feet wide, filling that with wood, setting it afire, letting it burn down to coals, butchering animals. It could be a pig, sheep. If they did cows, they would quarter them. They would butterfly them, stick poles in it, and then it was the job of someone to continually flip that for even cooking. Another person would have a bucket with vinegar and spices. They would just walk up and down the trench and dab the meat to keep it moist. And then we're gonna go counterclockwise. You see there's a guy there with the shovel with some coals. There was a separate fire maintained. That person's job was just to walk up and down the trench and look for cold spots and add those coals. Then we see some white spectators just holding the whole thing. At the top here, we've got a couple of guys that are practicing their instruments because African Americans provided the after barbecue entertainment. Then we've got a couple of cauldrons at top where guys making something called Brunswick stew. If you're from Virginia or Georgia, you know about this, and I know y'all fight about who started it first because there's a Brunswick County in each one of those, but it's a chicken and vegetable stew. And then I like the passion. And then we've got this guy in a top hat, white dude who's just pointing at stuff. We have no idea of his barbecue expertise, but he's the guy that gets the entire credit for this barbecue, even though based on black labor. All right, next slide. So this is from Bon Appetit magazine in 2003. Let's zoom in. Do you all remember the Where's Waldo cartoons of the 1990s? Now, the virtue of that is that Waldo was somewhere in the illustration, right? Where are the black people? All right, let's just cut to the chase. None to be found in this article representing all of the who's who in barbecue. Closest we get to diversity is we've got an Asian American guy with the beach ball in the middle, and we've got a woman talking to this dude on the side if you go immediately to the left. All right, so next slide. So the question is, how do we get from that Harper's Weekly magazine to that Bon Appetit magazine? Next slide. And why am I saying next slide? I should just click. My bad. And so that's why I wrote Black Smoke is a celebration of African American barbecue to say if you're going to talk about barbecue in the U.S., you need to include African Americans. Well, one thing that was very important to me was to go through barbecue's early history. So just very quickly, Columbus and his crew show up in the Caribbean, and on the left is what they see. There were no humans around, but they saw a wooden platform raised above a slow fire with iguanas, fish, and other items on it being slowly smoked. Now, true to what was going to happen over the next couple hundred years, they just helped themselves to the food without asking for permission. And then when the Native Americans come around the corner and behold the sight, they were grateful because Columbus and his crew left the iguanas alone, and that was the delicacy, all right? So that and barbecue comes from the word that the indigenous people used for the raised platform. Spanish thought they heard something that sounded like barbacoa, and then in English it becomes barbecue. So barbecue really applied to the raised platform first, and then later the cooking process and the food. Then I would argue that if you look at barbecue the way it plays out in the U.S., it's more similar to what the Native Americans of Virginia were doing. They had a very shallow pit method, and they would put rocks in wood, set the wood on fire, and this was genius, right? Because the rocks would retain the heat and keep cooking, and then they would either lay sticks across it and put the meat on top of the sticks to cook, or they would put the meat right on that rock and wood mixture to cook. My argument is that Native Americans are the foundation for barbecue, and later Europeans and Africans bring their stuff into the mix, and it puts us on the road to Southern barbecue. All right, so blackness and barbecue get wedded in the 16th century. Sorry for the formatting, I don't know why that's covered up. But this is a magazine or newspaper article written for readers in Maine. And the writer was trying to explain a Virginia barbecue. First 60, 70 years of barbecue, it was called Virginia barbecue. That's where people located its origin. And in this is very important because it points out about the third sentence there that a Negro man of reputation and skill was set up with his assistants to create a kiln of stones or a pit. Okay, so this says that if you're going to get the legitimate stuff, the best stuff, an African American is involved. And the reason why African Americans get involved is because old school barbecue was labor intensive, and the racial dynamic of our country is if you're going to have people do a lot of hard work and not pay them, you had enslaved African Americans do it. That's where the connection happens. Then we get after emancipation, because of decades of experience, actually a century or more of experience, African Americans enslaved and then free are barbecue's go-to cooks. So in this book, I go through several chapters of barbecue culture, and this chapter is about church barbecue. So what you find is that during slavery, barbecue became associated with church gatherings. So after the week, on most plantations, the work schedule would slow at noon on Saturday, and enslaved people got the rest of the weekend off until Monday morning. And so this was a time to do things around the cabin, garden, hunt, forage, fish, and make something time-intensive and labor-intensive like barbecue. And preachers figured out, hey, if I provide barbecue, I might get people to actually show up for church, all right? So those connections get made, and barbecue builds community because it was whole animal cooking. You know, your typical 175-pound hog is going to feed a couple hundred people, maybe even more. So on the left, you've got an ad from a church in Montana, a black church, showing about the barbecue. Here they're cooking beef. And then for those who are longtime Denver residents, you'll recognize the guy on the right. That is Daddy Bruce Randolph Sr., legendary barbecue guy. He was a man of faith, and I wanted to include him in this chapter about church barbecue, even though he wasn't ordained clergy. I have to say, this chapter was distracting to my own spiritual life. Because every time I read the Bible, whenever I see the words burnt offering, my mind starts to wander. And then I remember the burning bush story, and I wonder, did Moses smell oak or hickory? All right, let me stop blaspheming. Then we have these people that I call barbecue freelancers. They have the skill, it's lucrative, it's marketable. They're put on wagons, trains, boats across the country to bring a taste of Southern barbecue. One was a guy named Columbus B. Hill, from West Tennessee, shows up in Denver in the late 1870s following a guy named Mohican Hill, who was a famous waiter in Denver. And in short order, he's doing barbecues for thousands of people. Then I talk about the business aspect of it. So these are, instead of wandering around, somebody decides to build a brick and mortar location. On the right, you've got Henry Perry, who's acknowledged as the father of Kansas City barbecue. Look at that eclectic menu, right? Barbecued meats, possum, raccoon, groundhog. The woman on the left, or on the right, is Ernestine Vanderval from Nicodemus, Kansas, who grows up there. It's the earliest all-black community in the U.S., the free all-black community in the U.S., and she becomes a barbecue person, then goes to California, and Walt Disney is one of her best customers, but she relocates back to Nicodemus and runs a barbecue restaurant there. The reason I'm showing you this is I want to show, unlike how it's commonly portrayed, in the black community, barbecue is not dude food. Okay? Sisters have been grilling it for themselves for a long time. In my own family, my mom was the griller in chief. Then there's this notion going around that barbecue should be unsauced. I think that's crazy. And I think most African Americans would say, says who? I've been to restaurants where I got a plate of barbecue with an ocean of sauce and little islands of meat poking through. That's how much sauce is the calling card. So this is an editorial cartoon that was placed in the Kansas City newspaper when Arthur Bryant, a famous barbecue guy, died. He's at the pearly gates, and St. Peter asked him one question: did you bring sauce? There are not a lot of examples of ads of barbecue sauce. This one that I found on the right was from a newspaper in Atlanta in 1907. The reason why I show this is because it has an African American in the image, right, who's doing barbecue the old school way. So it's signaling to people that this is authentic barbecue sauce. I have to tell you, I'm surprised that there wasn't a corollary to Aunt Jemima or Faustus or Uncle Ben's in barbecue, given the connection. It just never happens, but I'm surprised that doesn't happen. And then I talk about competition barbecue. Memphis in May is the world's largest competition. This is the first winner, a woman named Bessie Cathy, who showed up with a pickup truck and a basic grill setup and won the whole thing in 1978. Can you imagine that happening today? No. And so here's the main challenge. The media has fallen madly, deeply, and tenderly in love with white dudes who barbecue. And there's really 4 types of white dudes. First, you've got the Bubba type. This is the rural, working class dude, ball cap, overalls, all right? Then you've got the hipster, interesting facial hair, glasses, tattoos, piercings, maybe skinny jeans, but you don't see that a lot in barbecue. And then you've got the competition cook. These are the dudes out there with syringes, Bluetooth apparatus so they can monitor how their barbecue is cooking, that kind of person. And then you've got the tokes who smoke. So these are the fine dining chefs who are in barbecue in ways they never were 30 or 40 years ago. If you went to a fine dining restaurant, you may see a grilled option on the menu during the summer, but you never saw, it wasn't a regular thing because barbecue was for a long time has had a working class vibe in our country. Now I'm telling you, a lot of chefs feel like they have to show their chops by doing barbecue. And why is this happening? It's because of dudes like me, okay? I'm a foodie. I'm one of those cats who takes pictures of my food. Been doing it for 15 years. You should have seen the reactions 15 years ago when I started doing it. Now it's more commonplace. And what happens is in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, this group of foodies merges. And this is a group of people, they are intensely interested in food, especially regional expressions of food. They've got disposable income, so they're willing to travel for food experiences. And they're asking a lot of questions. One is, what is barbecue? And where do I get the good stuff? And the media that caters to this group, the Bon Appetits, the Gourmets, the Food Network, instead of having diverse storytelling, they just focused on those white dudes that I just talked about. So if you're new to barbecue and you're not from the South and you're not steeped in this tradition, you don't know any better. And so you're going to gravitate to where the people you trust, you're going to gravitate to those who are curating where to go and who's doing the best. And that's where it shifts. So before the 1990s, if you were going to do anything on barbecue, it would have been extremely weird not to include an African American. By the time the 90s are over, we get those covers like Bon Appetit, where it's commonplace. All right, so we move from a black aesthetic to a white aesthetic in barbecue. So now, 100 years ago, if you asked somebody what barbecue was, they would have done something similar to their Harper's Weekly illustration. They would have said, oh yeah, cooking a whole animal over a pit. Today, what do you hear? Oh, it's taking the lesser cuts of meat, it's cooking them at a low temperature, 220 to 225 degrees, for a long time, several hours, and making that delicious. Okay, that's a type of barbecue, but that's not what barbecue was for 200 years. In fact, technically, what people are calling barbecue these days, a lot of people, is really smoking, because it's indirect heat, not directly over the coals, and you're allowing the flavored smoke to perfume your meat. So low and slow is really not all aspects of barbecue. For a lot of African Americans, it was hot and fast, and then slow and slow. Using lesser cuts of meat, again, it was whole animal cooking for a long time. The transition happens in the turn of the 20th century as barbecue moves from a rural context to an urban context. It's harder to do that whole animal cooking in an urban context, so that's when people started shifting to smaller cuts of meat. Minimal seasoning, that's a chef's sensibility. I know a lot of people seasoning their meat with dry rubs and marinades, and it's delicious. But they're saying, no, you should just eat the meat, and it should be high quality meat, like Kobe beef or Wagyu beef. It's like, what are we talking about, right? And then no sauce, which I've already expressed my feelings on that. So just to end, when I first started this book, I thought it was going to be a swan song to African American barbecue and elegy, but no, I'm excited. It's just that the barbecue scene has shifted. You have more pop-up restaurants, you have people doing food trucks, and you have the brother and sister on the side of the road doing their thing. And we don't have to get deeply into this, but I've noticed a high correlation between barbecue in parking lots and strip clubs. I don't know what that's about, but I've just noticed that. All right, happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious, how did coleslaw come into the barbecue?
Yeah, very interesting. So it's thanks to our German immigrants who transplant themselves in the South. So coleslaw is derived from a German salad that comes here. So the potato salads and the coleslaw and the beans shows the German influence in barbecue. So in Central Texas especially, a lot of those immigrants that opened up the meat markets were German or Central European. And they had all this excess meat, after they carved for what the customers wanted. So they started smoking it and selling it to local field workers and ranch hands. And so that's how that barbecue tradition started. And that's why you can be anywhere in the world, and I'll tell you about that in a second, and you can have that meat market, Central Texas decor and vibe. An example, I was in Cairo talking to a bunch of chefs, and a guy comes up after my presentation and said, I would love for you to come and eat at my barbecue restaurant. I'm thinking, whatever, dude, barbecue in Egypt? But, he extended an invitation, I went. So I went out there. As I approached the restaurant, there's a giant golden steer in front. It's called Longhorn Barbecue in English. They've got a clear window with two huge smokers. You walk in, it's got the meat market vibe. They've got every professional logo, college and professional from Texas. They have saddles for seating. The guy saw me coming. He comes to the door and opens it, and he says, welcome to Texas. So, yeah.
So, Adrian, you were talking about sauce being important to you with barbecue, and obviously regional variations have developed through the United States. I wonder if you could speak for just a minute. I'm sure you could talk for a long time about it, but how the different styles of barbecue sauce developed.
Yeah, so the earliest barbecue sauce was what I described earlier with vinegar and some spices. And so that's the whole hog tradition in Virginia, Eastern North Carolina, and parts of South Carolina. So that's whole hog. When you get to Western North Carolina, you start to have more emphasis on pork shoulders, and you have tomato introduced. And that shows the change in attitude about tomatoes. For a long time, people would not eat tomatoes because botanically, they're part of the nightshade family, so people thought they were poisonous. And so over time, you start to see more tomatoes introduced from the point where when you get to, and also in South Carolina, North Florida, you have mustard sauces. But when you get to the deep South, you have kind of a mix of tomato and vinegar, a lot of tang. And then when you start to get to places like Memphis and more in the Midwest, it becomes more of a tomato base and sweeter and thicker. So you can see that kind of general change. Texas is a little interesting because you've got a mix of all of these. Most of the places I went to in Texas now don't have sauce. But they've started to introduce it, and then the sauce tends to be more like a hot sauce, so thin, vinegary, and a little spicy. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for speaking to our club. Much appreciated. I grew up in the South in Atlanta, and my father was a lover of barbecue, and we went to lots of barbecue places. And one of those places was Bobby and June's on 14th Street. And I really favor having collard greens with barbecue, and they had a special sauce for the collard greens that I have not been able to find anywhere. So I wonder if you have any advice for collard greens and sauces.
Wow, I've never had a sauced collard green. Was this a black run place? Oh, no? Okay, that explains it then. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I've never had I'm just kidding. All right, I've never had a sauce with collard greens. So the way I make my greens, I'm more of a mustard and turnip cream kind of guy. I just get my water, I put either my smoked pork or turkey in there, some onion and some garlic, and red pepper flakes. Boil it until all of that flavors the meat, and then I put in shredded pieces of collard greens in there. Turn it down from boil to medium and let it cook for 30 to 45 minutes if I'm doing mustard and turnip greens because they're delicate. And then an hour to an hour and a half if I'm doing collards or kale because it's just sturdier. And then I just put some hot sauce on top. So have another sauce for that. I'm going to put that out on social media. I've never heard of that. Do you know if the place is still open?
Yeah, I think both Bobby and June have died though, but I think they've carried on. That's my understanding. I haven't been back in Atlanta in about 7 years, so I don't know.
Okay, Bobby and June in Atlanta. On 14th Street. Okay, thank you. I've learned something today.
Hi, since Daddy Bruce is gone, Wayne's Barbecue is all I know. I know they're white guys, but what do you think of Wayne's?
Oh, no, I believe white people can barbecue. I'm just saying, don't give all the love to the white dudes. But no, Wayne's is very good. I think that's the best in this area. The other places I've been to around here are just okay. I've been to KT's and West End Tavern, just okay. I would say Wayne's and Lulu's are my favorite in this area. And now if you're going to go to Golden, there's a lot of good stuff in Golden. At the Colorado Mills, there's Rolling Smoke. That's pretty good. And there's also Roaming Buffalo. And I like Roaming Buffalo because they do bison and lamb, which I think is Colorado barbecue. They're the only place that regularly does that, consistently does that. And actually, I'm in discussions with Right now, they're one-way discussions, but I'm in discussions with the Lamb Board and the Bison Board about having a contest to create a signature Colorado barbecue dish. Because we can easily do that, and if you go into the history of these other regional styles, it's like completely made up. It's just somebody decides to do something, and then other people copy it, and then before you know it, it's a regional style.
Hi, Judy already mentioned Daddy Bruce, but that was my question. If you covered him in your book and all the great work he did beyond barbecue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at the end of my chapters, I usually pull out 2 stories, historically or contemporary, of somebody who represents the themes of that chapter. And so I try to enliven it. And for a lot of people, that was the best part of the book. And truth be told, that was my original vision for the book. I just wanted the history to be very kind of brief at the beginning, and then it was just going to be all profiles, but my editor didn't think people would want to see that. So, but that's probably one of the favorite parts of the book for most people.
So good to see you, Adrian.
Yeah, good to see you. My chaplain buddy.
Yes. You mentioned the decreased number of soul food restaurants, and coinciding also with these 3 years of COVID. What are some of the societal features across the board about this change over the long run?
Yeah, so how do we get this, even though the pandemic sped it up? So there's a lot of things happening. So one of the biggest things is the gentrification of a lot of black-run neighborhoods. And so the place that used to be the local joint is now a destination joint. And if people don't come back and support that, it's just not going to be around for too long. It's already hard enough to run a business. And so a lot of people lost that way. Another group of restaurants closed because the neighbors, again, part of the gentrification process, the new neighbors didn't like all that smoke. And so they would consistently complain and then get the government to cite them and all that kind of, and so several places closed because of that. One of the saddest examples to me is there's a place in Baltimore. The dude opened up when it was just country, and the city built towards him, and the new neighbors show up, and then within 5 years, he's closed. Same thing happened to Snoop Dogg's uncle in Portland. He had a place, and so I think that's part of it. And then the other major factor is barbecue in the old school way is hard work. And let me tell you, most people are not doing that. Most people have these computerized smokers. They're not even using a lot of wood. It's mainly gas fired with some wood just to flavor it, and y'all are falling for the faking of the funk. And so the ones that are doing the old school, and a lot of the black joints insist on doing it the old school way, the kids don't want to do it. So when that person retires or dies, that's it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if anybody has a question.
Do you personally, do you put a lot of thought between the different woods that are used in the barbecue, like mesquite versus...
What I use?
Yeah, in terms of what flavor it reveals.
So I'm a hickory guy, so that's what I cook with, but I primarily cook pork. But what you'll find in most restaurants now, they're using oak, because it's kind of neutral. And then on the competition circuit, something interesting is happening. And by the way, when I cook at home, I cook with a mix of charcoal and hickory wood. I get the best flavor out of that. Now, when I say at home, I'm really talking about at my father's place, because at my home, I live in a high-rise condo, and the Denver Fire Code says you can only cook with propane gas, and I'm not going to do that to you as my guest. So if I make barbecue for it, I go to my dad's house, who has a double oil drum smoker, and that's what I cook in. Most restaurants are using either hickory or oak, and what's interesting on the competition circuit is you're all trying to create that perfect bite, so people are layering the wood flavors as they cook. So they will start with hickory or oak, and then they will add some kind of fruit wood as they're finishing it to give a different taste. So they'll add cherry, peach, or maybe apple. And so, yeah, it's very complicated, and that's what they're doing on the competition circuit, because you just got to get that edge, right? So I've never cooked with mesquite. Most people complain about mesquite because it burns fast, and so you don't want to have too strong of a smoky flavor. So I actually don't know too many people who use mesquite unless they have a Traeger where they have the pellets and you can better control the smoke. And Pellet smokers, that's what they're derisively called, get a bad name. But to me, the Traeger pellets create a lot of smoke, and you get a lot of flavor. So I'm not mad at you if you cook on a Traeger. But when I'm on the barbecue circuit, a lot of people ask me for cooking tips, and they're asking me about, oh yeah, what should I do? When do you pull the meat? And so I'm like, look, man, I cook on an oil drum smoker, so I can't help you. And my stuff is still delicious. So, all right, well, thank you so much.
All right, Adrian. So, in practice, Rotary typically gets the last word. I don't like that we say that because we're grateful to have you, and it sounds bad that way. But Rotary has been committed to eradicating polio from the world since 1985, when the Polio Plus Foundation started, and actually even back in '79 when they started vaccination campaigns in the Philippines. Up to today, Rotary has donated over $2.1 billion and vaccinated over 3 billion children in 122 countries. We are, as we say, this close to eradicating polio. But if that work were to stop, 200,000 children a year would be subject to harm from polio and would be unable to walk, and in just a decade. And so, in your honor, we are donating 100 doses of polio vaccine. Thank you again for coming today.
Oh, thank you.